Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Andrea Armeni. I'm the Executive Director of Transform Finance, and today we'll be talking about funding the resistance, investing in activists as for-profit and non-profit entrepreneurs. Couple of housekeeping things. Once again, if you can, please mute yourself and use the chat function if you would like to ask a question. There will be a couple of moments where I will unmute everyone if you want to chime in, but best way to do it is just to do it through the WebEx chat function. So we appreciate your staying on mute and submitting your questions and comments in that way. Today we are joined by Julie Menter of New Media Ventures and Sarah Williams of Propel Capital. I'm very excited about this presentation, and we have been following the work of both New Media Ventures and Propel for quite a while, and we're excited to have them both here sharing it with us. And as a quick word of update for the members of the Investor Network, you've heard from us previously about the report on alternative financing structures for innovation. We now have an executive summary available on our website. If you go under blog, you will find an entry there. And the final full report with the case studies will be available coming from the Inter-American Development Bank that is supporting that project with us in a week or 2 weeks. So stay tuned. Let us know if you want to be notified of that. Secondly, many of you have heard about our racial justice and finance project. There's a broad analysis that we're doing with the Rockefeller Foundation on how capital allocation decisions affect racial justice. Where does race show up in finance, and what could a values-aligned asset owner do about that, and what role can others in the world of finance, from asset managers to fund managers, do to be better aligned with their racial justice practices. Tomorrow we'll have our first convening with racial justice practitioners as a way to hear from them what has been their experience of capital in their communities, and see how they view the possibility of engaging with the world of asset ownership as an additional tool for advancing a racial justice agenda. So as for today, we're still talking about this broader universe of social change strategies that can happen through finance. And today, specifically, we want to look at it from the perspective of the world that we live in today, right? There have been some meaningful political changes that correlate quite directly with the with issues of enfranchisement, political and economic, within the United States. People feeling like the economy essentially is not working for them, right? And as an urban enemy of Candide has said in one of his postings, are we in our work really redefining who wins and who loses in the economy through our investment practices? So we're going to be looking at that intersection in order to see how could communities reclaim their power, both in the economic sense, but also in the political sense, in terms of having their voice heard, feeling like they have agency, like there is accountability to them, and seeing one specific piece of this, which is the funding of activist efforts, let's say, both at the non-profit and at the for-profit level, to see how we can get more of these entrepreneurs funded and support their tremendous work on the ground. And for those that have looked at the work that we do, less from the investor side, but more from the community side, this might seem familiar because of the Transform Finance Institute for Social Justice Leaders, where we explore with community leaders, social justice practitioners, two strategies around this. One is in recognition of the fact that there is not enough capital to go around for in the form of grants to support social justice and social change nonprofit efforts. There is a need to look at earned revenue strategies for a lot of the work that has been done. And the other is this idea that the market can actually in itself be one of the tools that we use in order to advance social change. We think of it oftentimes, as you've seen in the past, with the example of the People's Community Market, where a group of food justice activists trying to address the issue of food deserts in Oakland, in the San Francisco Bay Area, combined their activism, their political action, their advocacy efforts with ultimately saying, you know what, we need to join the fray. We're going to find a way in which we can actually enter the market and open our own food outlet that is governed and controlled by the community, that really respond to their needs and aspirations, so that we can achieve the change that we want in a somewhat less traditional way of doing social change work by actually becoming entrepreneurs. Now, as to who gets to be an entrepreneur, is one of the things that Julie will address with us. Of course, it matters a lot who gets funded. And in order to get funded, first of all, you need to get found, right? We need to democratize the broader end of the pipeline for the people that might not even think of themselves as entrepreneurs, that might not even have familiarity with the world of accelerators, with the world of incubators, and see how we can bring some of these opportunities to join the movement through investable opportunities to them as well, and also through grant-funded processes. So this is a broad democratization of how capital flows that, again, has been one of our ongoing topics. The twist that I would give to it is that the way in which investments are structured actually affects deeply who gets to be funded, right? If we're looking just at traditional venture capital models, that means that it will be the type of enterprises that have the possibility, as they say, to return the fund, right? Something that can look like a 10x on the back end, which leaves out a lot of entities that have excellent impact and that have actually good prospects to survive and thrive as organizations. They just don't have that type of return. So we're looking at how one can structure investments a little bit differently from a traditional venture capital term sheet in order to reach more organizations, but also considering the fact that from a traditional venture capital fund perspective, you expect 7, maybe 8 out of 10 investments to fail or to flounder a bit. Which is a risk that a fund itself can bear because they will make it up with the other 2 that can return the fund. That is not quite the case for an entrepreneur that might come from a less advantaged background, that can't really take that risk and say, oh, well, I'll just be a repeat entrepreneur, right? That's particularly the case for folks that might have other financial responsibilities too. They can't afford to say, well, if it fails, I will fail forward and it will be good for my resume. No, they actually need this thing to succeed. And again, looking at different ways of financing those entities through structured exits, revenue-based loans, redeemable equity is part of the work that will be featured in that forthcoming report that I mentioned. And with that as a little bit of context setting, I will turn it over to Julie, who is the principal at New Media Ventures, and I really look forward to your presentation. Thank you for joining us, Julie.
Thank you. Glad to be here. So good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Glad to be here. New Media Ventures is in the business of catalyzing innovation to advance progressive change. And so we fund basically startups and new projects of existing organizations that are looking to drive broadly, advance progressive issues broadly using new technologies. And we think the moment is particularly ripe to do so. If you go to the next page, there we kind of see 4 important trends that are coming together right now that make the possibility of technology, new media, and innovation a really powerful tool to advance progressive change and social justice. So Those four elements you'll see here on this slide. The first is citizen mobilization. It should be no surprise to any of you that we are in a moment of, in the US, where we focus our work, unprecedented levels of citizen mobilization, of people realizing we've been to some degree asleep at the wheel, and that we need to, kind of reclaim our political power. And with that, kind of amazing things become possible. Number of groups who have seen the donations they're getting from grassroots explode is incredible, and people willing to, make calls, show up at town halls, kind of that wide range of activities that we're seeing in the U.S. right now. In addition to that, which is a more recent phenomenon, there's also kind of build-up of what technology makes possible that we think is really incredible. At the top end, or the more technologically sophisticated end of things, I would say, there's this, kind of what we're calling empathy machines, this idea of augmented reality, virtual reality, and new ways essentially to connect and tell stories. That is still kind of, not broadly adopted, but is starting to uncover really interesting ways of connecting online. And then on the other end, the less kind of sophisticated end of it, but I think actually in some ways more important, is those levels of mobile penetration. For a long time, anyone who was creating an app or using the internet to try to advance social justice was facing this massive challenge that folks who had mobile phones, in particular smartphones, were disproportionately higher income people. But now actually mobile phones and smartphones in particular are the dominant way that low-income communities, communities of color access the internet. And so actually thinking about mobile first and strategies for technology become much more promising, and many more possibilities have been opened in using broadly the internet and emerging technologies as a tool for change and reaching communities that are previously really hard to reach. And then the last thing is really the kind of ongoing transformation and potential available thanks to social media and the internet and the way that it connects us. So, it was the original promise of the internet when it was started, this idea like anyone can be heard, anyone can have a voice online, and that quickly became kind of intermediated. It was just as soon as we got so much content on the internet, we then started to rely on Google and Facebook and a number of algorithms that we don't fully understand and definitely don't control to decide what it is that we hear from. And we're seeing right now massive pushback on that, or better awareness of those algorithms, and people who are really finding very large communities online, and folks who now have an opportunity to be heard who previously weren't being heard. When you have 6 channels and 6 news anchors across TV channels or a handful of radio stations, the number of people who get to have a voice and their stories get to be heard and be important is obviously much lower than is possible now. So we have a different set of challenges, obviously, around filter bubbles and echo chambers and all of these things that are well documented, but it is also an incredible opportunity for new voices to be heard. So we see these 4, and just to lay the groundwork of things that are that we are excited about and think really open new possibilities. So if you think about, in some ways, New Media Ventures was inspired by what happened with Move On, the ability to aggregate really large numbers of people online, and this initial version of activism online of like a petition leading to people showing up. This set of broader technologies make kind of what is possible online right now really, really transformative. So if you can go to the next slide. Basically, given that's kind of at the meta level, but the stuff that we are interested in at New Media Ventures is, harnessing kind of these, trends and tools to accelerate the work of social change leaders. And we do that by essentially finding and funding what we think are really promising and really kind of different innovators than typically get funded in Silicon Valley. I'm based in the Bay Area, and kind of up and close familiar with what typically gets funded here and the all on demand everything. And we think there's a lot more innovation happening that needs capital. And then there's also a big part of just cultivating an ecosystem that increases odds of success. And so, one of the things that we talk a lot about is really encouraging impact investors to think, and I know, this community kind of knows it in spades, but there's something about, thinking beyond just thinking about how you're moving capital, thinking about the kinds of people that you're funding, the terms that you're using. Those are all things that we're really interested in and work with funders to talk about. And in terms of the kinds of things that we fund more specifically, there's kind of like three big buckets. One is around movement building, people who are essentially using advocacy to build power. New narratives, folks who are telling new stories, elevating new voices, changing what it is that we care about. And then finally, civic engagement. So how do we essentially transform the energy that people might have into actual political power? So that is a lot of just voting technology, for example. All of that we see as a really important driver of social justice. Obviously, there's incredible amounts of work happening, but this is the area where we think there's a lot of potential for scale, where a little bit of money can go a really long way, and where you're putting kind of tools into the hands of people who can then, make big change happen. And one thing, feel free to just, in the chat, ask questions along the way. I'm going to go through this hopefully fairly quickly and happy to just have a conversation. So to date, we've funded 42 different startups. We've mobilized kind of new media ventures in our network of angel investors and grant makers have invested $9 million. Those organizations have then kind of raised 50 million. And then we were talking this morning, we evaluated 1,000 startups. Our last kind of round of funding, we evaluated by 100. So this is actually number is quite outdated. It's probably closer to, 1,500 or 2,000 startups evaluated. But we basically, spend a lot of time looking at interesting innovation. Can you go to the next page? So this is probably too small for anybody to look at, but just want to give you a little bit more of a sense of our portfolio because it can get a little abstract using all of those words. So we do a lot of, as you can see, a lot of our investments are around movement building. And so we both fund for-profit and nonprofit startups. And so that's where a lot of the nonprofits tend to exist. They're advocacy movements. The most well-known are probably groups like Some of Us, that does corporate accountability work, Ultraviolet, that works on women's rights. But a number of other kind of either issue-specific advocacy organizations or broadly, progressive organizations. And then also a lot of the tools that they need to succeed. So tools like Attentively that helps folks manage social media influencers. Tools like To Someone that helps organizations send better and more effective email. A lot of things that in some ways are fairly pedestrian, but when accumulated, really can help take the impact of an advocacy organization to the next level. So for example, one of the examples we like to use is AxBlue Civics. So AxBlue, before we made this investment in civics, was really focused on political fundraising. So they were used by candidates who were running for office to raise money. And we basically went to them and said, hey, this tool that you have and this database of donors that you have could actually be really helpful for 501c4 organizations. So as you all know, it's really hard capital to raise, this kind of campaigning capital. And so we said, hey, we put in together basically $250,000 for them to build out the C4 component of the tool. And since then, they've raised tens of millions of dollars for C4 organizations using civics. And now that has given them the ground to do also charities and C3 funding. So there's just a very kind of simple, in some ways, interventions that can have really outsized impact. So that's a sense of the movement building piece. And then narrative change, we funded some groups who do storytelling, kind of online media platforms. Upworthy is probably the most well-known in that bucket. Daily Kos also, and Blavity, which is a news platform for Black millennials. And so really, again, finding new stories, elevating new voices, helping to change the narrative. And then the tools those organizations need to succeed. And then finally, kind of all of that we think would be incomplete without thinking about civic engagement. So how do we, help it make it easier for people to register to vote? How do we make sure people have the data they need to vote? So one thing just to highlight here, for example, the Center for Technology and Civic Life aggregates all of the data necessary to answer the questions, where's my polling location, who's going to be on my ballot, And their data essentially powers, if you're in Google or in Facebook or Google, and also it was available on Facebook, but if you're in Google and you say, where's my polling place? The answer will give you actually polls from the data. So the Center for Tech and Civic Life is a nonprofit organization, but they get a lot of their revenue from providing API data to Google and to Facebook, and their data was sprayed, over 100 million times in the last election. So those are kind of, points of intervention that we think have potential. So all of this, we think, drives to social justice. Andrea was pointing out that it looks like it's a funnel and like there's nothing in social justice. So this diagram isn't quite right. But overall, those are all kind of points of intervention we think can really help advance change.
Julie, can you spend just a second explaining the difference between C3 and C4 money?
Yeah. So C3 money is typical kind of charitable money and that we're most familiar with. And the key thing with C3 money is that if you donate, you get a tax deduction. So you can write off that donation from your income statement, from your taxes. C4 money is much easier to incorporate as a 501c4, and you have much more flexibility in what you can do. So if you donate to a C4, you don't get a tax deduction, which makes it harder for folks to fundraise that money because you don't have the benefit for donors. But it gives a lot more flexibility to organizations to do campaigning work. So there's a lot of restrictions in the tax code for 501c3s in terms of how much lobbying and advocacy work they can do and campaigning work. And C4s have much more flexibility, so they can take on, they can do a lot more lobbying, they can participate in campaigns, they can endorse candidates with some limitations. So there's a lot more, if we think about, advocacy and movement building, a lot of the new groups that have emerged after the elections are 501c4s, like, Indivisible, for example, because they want to be able to say, hey, this specific senator is making the wrong call, you need to call them. And if you're 501c3, there are possibilities, but it is more complex. So if we're thinking about changing power and shifting power, C4 money is really important. Here's a quick breakdown of the same set of organizations, but between nonprofits and for-profits. And so you can see we funded more nonprofits, but typically more capital goes to the for-profits. And so that's just kind of a breakdown of that. And maybe just a couple things to highlight here. There's I guess 2 points that I want to pick up on what you were saying, Andrea. One is survival rate, right? This idea of like, is it do you need the 2 startups out of 10 to succeed? We did some looking at our portfolio. We want to make sure we're taking risk and we're often the first institutional funder. And so if everything was still around, then we would have failed. And so overall, about 60% of the organizations, actually, no, it's higher than that. About 70% of the organizations that we funded are still around. So our kind of fail rate is much lower than the typical VC. But on the other end, so, we're also looking at organizations that might not provide, 10x return, but actually have, are solid organizations that we think, have potential to grow year over year and provide on the for-profit side, provide returns to investors, though not in the unicorn realm of things. And so, to give you a couple of examples, last year, 3 of the startups in our portfolio were acquired, and kind of a range of outcomes. TinyGive was acquired, and the return was just kind of, it was a convertible note, and it was just the interest on the note. So it was a small kind of 5-6% return, but fairly quickly. So that was, it's always good to get the money back. Attentively was also acquired by Blackbaud, which is a big nonprofit technology vendor. And they provided a return to investors. What was interesting there is that by the time the acquisition had happened, investors had such a large share of the investment that the entrepreneurs who had put in 3 or 4 years of their life into this got very little money. I mean, they got some money, but definitely not commensurate to what I think they deserved. And so it's an interesting question, I think, when you think about term sheets of like, okay, how much equity is the entrepreneur retaining and how much are they trading the ongoing viability of the company and putting more capital in the company, and then their potential exit. And then the last one is CrowdTangle that was acquired by Facebook, and that was a good return for investors in the depending on who invested when, kind of in the 3x range. So really, really interesting return there. So that's a sense of things there. A number of organizations still around, a number have, like EdgeFlip came out of the Obama campaign 2012, and then the Facebook algorithm changed, and what they were able to get actually from the API, from the data, changed completely. That destroyed their business model and their ability of their product to provide any value. And so it was, one of those things you're like, Facebook has incredible reach, but it's also really challenging to build your business off of that. So just to give you a sense of a few examples there. So what we look for, as I said, we fund startups. On the nonprofit side, actually, we also fund new projects of established organizations. It can be really challenging for large or mid-sized nonprofits to get capital for technology specifically, so that is where we intervene. As I said, structure agnostic, for-profit, nonprofit, and then nonprofit, we kind of do the full spectrum of 501c3, 501c4s, and actually this latest cycle, we're doing some 527s, which are even more political organizations. I'll tell you more about that in a little bit. As I mentioned, one of the key things for us really is organizations that are scalable, that have a potential for earned revenue stream. And so really thinking about, we don't have it like there's so much to do, so many challenges to address, so little time, wrangling capital is challenging. Our bias is really towards organization where a little bit of money can go a long way, and where organization will be able to, even on the nonprofit side, generate revenue so that they can not just rely on philanthropic capital to survive over the long term. And so that's a really important criteria for us, looking at things where, we can have a point of intervention and it can down the line be really big and have a big impact. We also really care about folks who think about distribution. So what we're finding now more and more is people will come, a few years ago, people would come and they have a great idea, but they didn't know how to build the technology. And now folks come and usually they have the idea and the technology. They understand that you can't, like if you're going to have a tech startup, you kind of need to know how to build technology. But the piece that is missing now more and that is missing, and one that is a really important filter for us, is looking at viable distribution strategies. So how do you make sure that you're, if it's a media organization, you get in front of your audience. If you're a tech company, you get into the hands of people. In particular, if you're selling products to advocacy organizations who, as you all know, are stretched super thin, have no time, limited resources, it's a challenging market. And so we're really interested in folks who have kind of direct relationships or a sense of how to get things to market. And even in the nonprofit side as well, I mean, it's the same thing where you need to make sure you have a strategy and you have a set of relationships to get that into the hands of the people you're trying to serve or trying to have as customers. Another piece for us is we intervene, or our sweet spot is that when organizations have a proof of concept. So if it's just, hey, I just have this idea, I have this relevant background, usually it's too early for us, and we wait until this idea has encountered reality. As I'm sure all of you know, the distance between what sounds like a good idea and what is actually a good idea can be pretty large, and what sometimes intuitively makes sense doesn't actually pan out in reality. And so we encourage entrepreneurs to really kind of test as early as possible that their idea actually has legs and actually has potential. And so in that way, kind of our big proponents of like lean methodologies, and how do you quickly get like very rough types, products, solutions in front of your potential customer, your potential audience, get feedback, iterate, learn, rather than developing something big and then finding out that you kind of missed the mark. Another piece that's really important is the team. Even after a proof of concept, the reality is that the product or service or solution will evolve quite a bit between what you start off with and where you end up. And so having really strong teams who are able to both have a strong vision of the change they want to see in the world and are able to listen and learn and iterate and refine is a really important component. And we find that diverse teams are able to do that much better than teams that are really homogeneous. And is really important for us, for folks to have direct experience of the problem they're looking to solve. Other people, there's this amazing article that's worth looking up if you haven't seen it already, which is basically the beauty of other people's problems, how easy it is for us to think that other people's problems are small and simple and that they, are easy to solve. And in some degrees, it's more of a tangent. We're seeing this right now in, Silicon Valley saying like, oh, politics is broken. We just, like, everyone who's ever been involved in politics forever was just stupid, and I will now come in and solve it and disrupt it for them. I think this problem kind of applies, in all categories. And so folks who actually know the problem intimately are much better positioned to actually solve it. And then final thing, we're focused in the U.S. And so that's a big kind of lens for us in what we look at.
Great. And two quick questions, Julie, on that already. One was on what you mean by scale of these organizations, like more or less what you're looking at. And then for your own scale, whether there is any interest on the part of New Media Ventures to expand internationally as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what I mean by scale is really thinking about, so we're looking for interventions that have potential to impact like all of the U.S., so not a specific geography. And we're also, I think, training is a good example of how we think about scale. So you can do, training is incredibly important right now, and it's always been incredibly important, but in advocacy. So as a number of new people are getting involved, how do we make sure they quickly come up to speed and don't make like the same mistakes every new organizer's ever made? There's a steep learning curve, how to make sure people come up that learning curve as quickly as possible. And a lot of the interventions we're seeing are people who've developed a curriculum and then they deliver that curriculum to people. It's great curriculum. They're like, I want funding to deliver this curriculum more to more people. The challenge there is that like every new person is the exact same cost as the first person that you train. And so we're looking at, okay, what are the interventions where the 10th person you train or the 100th person you train costs way less because there's so many people that need to be trained. And so, some people will then say, well, we could do a train the trainer program. So we'll train someone and then they'll train other people and they'll go on. And that is, bringing in some degree of scale, but that's not as strong a scaling approach as say, hey, let's actually put this curriculum online and have an opportunity to interact with real people. And it's maybe more of a home study program. And there's some degree of repository that's online. There's an online community of people. So we still want it to be effective because as we all know, when you're just learning things in, video online, it's nowhere near as effective as sitting in a classroom somewhere. And so what's that right balance of bringing in more of that classroom experience online? So that's an example of what we mean by scalable. And then in terms of our scale and looking beyond the U.S., we're a nonprofit organization. The folks who fund us are really interested in impact in the U.S., so that's been our focus. I'm originally from France, so you probably can't hear it. And so that's definitely, I'm always thinking about like how do we take this abroad? But I have to say, there's so much work to be done here that I think we'll be busy for a while.
And thank you. And similarly, in terms of that tension, a question that came in from Satyajit between your mission to really reach this new group of entrepreneurs and requiring an existing proof of concept. I imagine you want the success. Let me see if I can mute someone. You want the success, but you also want to have that broader reach. How do you think about that, like tension?
Yeah, no, and it's definitely a tension because there are steps before our intervention that are critical. And we're doing some writing right now to help people navigate that. Because the typical step, right, is I went to Stanford and I got a CS degree, and me and my buddies from my fraternity, have enough money from our parents that we can start something. And that just doesn't apply to the vast majority of potential entrepreneurs. And so there's, fellowship programs, there is a number of other kind of early incubator programs that we think are really promising and that are earlier than our point of intervention. So there is a lot of important work there that needs to happen. Is not kind of the scope of what we do, but is, kind of we definitely benefit from. The other piece is there are a ton of entrepreneurs who are at the proof of concept level and who just the doors just don't open for them because they just look different, have a different background, have a different set of networks. So one example would be Blavity, started by this young Black woman. And so like if you're Black and you're a woman, like your chances of getting VC funding are just like the statistics are not in your favor. And it really, like, she had an incredible traction. At the time that we looked at the company, they had 1 million monthly users on the website, which is kind of insane if you're in the, media world, just as a, year-old company. But she just wasn't getting the meetings because she didn't have the networks with like the traditional VC community. So just by having an open process and making it very easy for her to find us, we were able to kind of get her then on the map and be like, hey, we vetted her, she's amazing, put together her initial round of funding, and then she was off to the races, went through 500 startups, has raised more capital. And so it was like she was out there, she had a job, had a little bit of money to start something. And so, I guess all that to say, there's definitely an important role for incubation, early stage work, which is outside of what we do. And then there is also a ton of entrepreneurs out there who just aren't getting the meetings, and we make sure they get the meeting.
Right. So that is in part a call to action for others who can come in even earlier to support the incubation pre-proof of concept of many of the organizations that would then come through New Media Ventures.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
So I'll share just a couple of stories of impact of our portfolio, just to give you a sense, more tangible sense of some of the impact stories that we've seen. So one of the companies that we funded was Upworthy. We put together their first round of funding kind of at the angel stage, and with our angel network, put together a round of capital to get them started. And what they found with some funding from the Gates Foundation that really helped them, measure the impact of their stories was that, storytelling and empathetic storytelling in particular does change people's beliefs and people's, kind of desire to take action. And so our theory of like, you start with a story, it encourages people to want to take action, and then you have an advocacy organization that helps them actually translate that into, action, is things that we see working together really well. And I think this research here, which, on this topic was focused on childhood marriage, which I don't even want to think about too much. But anyways, this idea that like actually storytelling is a really powerful lever for change, we found really interesting. And as a side note, Upworthy was merged this year with Good, which is another kind of online storytelling for good platform. And so the company is no longer independent. It was not actually an amazing outcome for investors, but it was in terms of mission preservation and the ability to create a larger organization that is focused on this idea of telling stories that move people to action. We're excited about that kind of continuing. If you go to the next one. The other example, a company that we, think does really interesting work is Harken. And what Harken does is it allows a news organization to embed a module on their website to solicit questions from the public. So instead of, having journalists sit in an editorial room and say, what things are interesting for us to cover today, it's instead actually asking your audience, what is of interest to you? What do you want to know about? And really helping to have journalism be more participatory. That's like in and of itself, I think a really interesting and really important piece of work. What is even more interesting to me was this example of this woman, Janice, who submitted a question around electricity in Chicago, got it answered by a reporter, and that the answer just gave her such an experience of like, wow, I have agency, I can learn new things, and I'm really outraged by where our electricity comes from, that I'm actually going to take action. And so this idea that just starting with a simple question ended up, having this person start a new organization, to me is really inspiring of what is possible when we think about media and changing the way journalism works in a more expansive way. Harken is actually the company also that put together this little diagram that Andrea was sharing at the beginning, the like, you know, lazy unicorns and the hardworking zebras, because they're really thinking about building their company in a way that really preserves the mission, and they're being really thoughtful about how much capital they raise and who they raise the capital from to make sure that they are kind of continuously positioned for impact and not just, you know, growth for growth's sake. So they're an interesting company to kind of learn more about, and they're really pushing this idea of, instead of striving to have unicorns, which are not real animals, we should be building zebras, which are creative and hardworking, and it's kind of their, you know, trying to shift the narrative we have around startups and what we aspire for, and have us aspire to things that are, you know, actually additive to society rather than providing big returns to a handful of people. So that's Harken. And then the next one is Coworker, which is a nonprofit organization. And this is more an example of kind of what is possible when you're using data and advocacy. So Coworker brings together folks, you know, in the workplace to demand change. And they're really kind of the sweet spot is for very distributed work sites that are very hard for unions to organize. And so they bring together, for example, Starbucks baristas. You know, you have 2 to 5 to 10 baristas at any Starbucks, but they're all they're not really, it's hard for them to be in touch with each other and realize that the things that they are experiencing are actually happening across Starbucks locations across the US, and that they might, in aggregating their demands, actually get change to happen. And so they're starting to see that happen in a number of places. So kind of like their overall model. But the addition piece of that we found really interesting was that then they're getting all of this data on the people who work at different places, how much money they're making, where they're located, and what their working conditions are. That can be very helpful for journalists, or very helpful for, you know, anyone wanting to take action or surfacing issues that we might not know about. So if you go to the next slide, it has a little bit of the actual example there of what they found, asking the workers who were on their platform data on how much money they were making. And what they found was essentially, you know, the Black and Latino restaurant workers were earning considerably less than their white counterparts. And that was, you know, it's something that, you know, we can talk about racism at a high level, but then being able to get this data at a super specific level allows you to take a different set of actions because you have the data to back a demand than might be able to where it's, you know, with anecdotal data. So it just gives you a sense of, you know, both what is possible, you know, this age of online organizing, and kind of what you do when you use data smartly. Can you go to the next one? So the other thing I want to talk about is more like the mechanics of all of this. New Media Ventures was started 6 years ago as a network of angel investors. And so we would essentially find deals, and then we'd approach, you know, the network and say, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Identify a lead investor, and then they would, you know, kind of in partnership with us, raise around the capital. And what we found was it was very easy for folks who were either well-known, were already a proven entrepreneur in some other sector, to raise capital from our network, because they were already, you know, I think Upworthy actually is a pretty great example, because it was started by Eli Pariser. He was, you know, already kind of famous, and Peter Crickley was also, you know, famous, and so it was easy for people to be like, oh, I'll back these people, they're well known, they're successful entrepreneurs. So what we found is then when it came to other startups, Attentively is probably an example where it was started by 2 women, and it was you know, they were from the nonprofit sector, and they were trying to start a for-profit company, and people were just like, I'm not so sure. And so it ended up, Attentively actually got their first round of funding from someone else. And then they came back to us a little bit later, and we were able to, once they had a little bit more traction, you know, get funding from our network. But for all of the, you know, Attentively's who were able to get a little bit of funding and come back to us, there are a number of organizations that just couldn't get the funding and never got off the ground, which is why we started this innovation fund, really to provide capital at an earlier stage, take higher risk, make smaller investments, and help kind of de-risk early stage investments, and help really diversify the pipeline of innovation. So the innovation fund, it's actually philanthropic capital, so it's 501c3 capital that is pooled that we make grants out of, and those are just straight kind of grants, we don't expect the money back, and investments. And so that allows us to essentially, because it is nonprofit capital, we would like the money back from the investment so that we can further reinvest. But it is really our primary focus there is on mission. One other thing to mention here is the investment terms, and Andrea and I have had actually kind of ongoing conversations about this, which is our investment terms are typically very, very simple, like as vanilla as they come, convertible notes, because we want to reduce, lawyer costs for everybody involved, and because typically what we do is we'll make an investment and then we'll go to our network to invest alongside us. And, angel investors, like, similarly would like things to be simple. And while we'd love to experiment with alternative exits and different deal terms, like the level of, complexity it adds to deals that are already kind of small and what does that all mean is definitely an ongoing conversation. So I'm always kind of inspired by the reports and the work that Transfer Finance is doing to really help push us towards thinking about different deal terms, because to date we've done one SAFE, which is kind of the YC-backed thing that we kind of have issues with, and then a lot of convertible notes. And so that's kind of an ongoing discussion around different deal terms. Can you go to the next page?
Yeah, and I will add just quickly there, Julie, because
Yep.
there was a question, about how you structure, what are the term sheets for the grant. So my understanding is that your grants are just straight grants, but I do want to highlight that there are some interesting efforts that have come out of Omidyar networks, for example, around doing recoverable grants, where upon a pre-established event, the grant will be repaid and flow back into the funding pool for the next round. In the structure, we've seen a few of them that are interesting. Some are structured so that the repayment comes upon a subsequent round of funding. So if this gets you off the ground and then you're able to run by yourself, it kind of makes sense that you would repay that out of the next round. There have been some that are more interesting, including one from the Inter-American Development Bank that they call informally the "Don't Pay for Success," where if you are successful at achieving the impact that you would like, you don't have to repay the grant. Otherwise, if you are successful on the financial side, but you've kind of wobbled on the impact side, those are not the technical terms for it, the grant becomes repayable upon that event. And some of those, again, are detailed in the report that we mentioned at the beginning.
Very cool. Yeah, and it's this recoverable grant seems to be gaining more traction, and will be interesting to track how that goes. So I guess one thing I want to tell you about more specifically, so this is like all the context in Media Ventures, what we're up to, all the things. One of the ways we do our funding is we have an open call twice a year. It is one of the ways that we allocate the capital in the innovation fund. And the reason we do open calls is that, one, it can be very hard for people to get this first meeting with investors. Most investors only invest in companies that they are referred to them from a trusted network. So the challenge is if you don't have access to like any entry point on the trusted network, you can never get funding. And so that's why we have a very open process where anyone can pitch us and we'll look at everything. The second reason for open call is that because we invest $50,000, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, like the diligence costs actually are quite high, and to just move $50,000 in many cases for kind of traditional investors, not even worth their time to just be moving kind of this little bit of money. And so doing an open call allows us to batch process the diligence and essentially reduce, bring down diligence costs to make this more efficient. And so in response to the election, we, saw all these newly politicized people and all this challenge, kind of highlighted challenges around in media. and really focused our open call, our latest open call this kind of winter on these two things. How do we resist, the challenges that are coming, in particular to communities that are most vulnerable, and how do we rebuild? What are we doing next? In particular, instead of just fighting fake news, how do we actually build media that has business models that don't prey on our attention? That would be an example. So that's what the call to action that we put. And if you go to the next page, this is what happened. So we got 500 applications, which was kind of insane. This time last year, essentially, we gotten just a little bit over 100, so 5x kind of increase in number of people trying to, wanting to take action at this intersection of, innovation and progressive change, which was amazing. 250 we actually reviewed, and we interviewed 60 with the help of the volunteer investment committee. So just as a call out to anyone on the phone, we're always recruiting folks to join our investment committee. It's a really great way to get a sense of like what is happening out in the world right now. It's about 10 hours of work that folks do on a volunteer basis to review applications and help us vet startups. For us, it really makes sure, we're a small team. There is no way that we would ever know all the things. And so having an investment committee of 10 to 20 people, depending on how many applications we've received, really helps us make sure we don't miss anything big. And then we got 30 finalists and funded 14, and then kind of with our final diligence. So the 14 are on our website. I think the next page has the list, but it's also probably too small to read in any way. You can go to the next page. Yeah, it's probably too small. Anyways, it's on our website. Happy to send you more information. We think the Slate, in this moment of kind of unprecedented mobilization and just really, really large number of organizations starting or amping up their work, we have found it can be really confusing for folks to know, like, where should I be putting my capital? And so we're really encouraging folks, like, if you're in the bucket of, like, I want to do something, but I don't know why, it's because there is so much, is to just move money to this slate of startups that are doing, incredible work and obviously rose to the top from a really large number. And you'll see here in the fiscal status column, if you can squint, that we funded C3, C4, 527s, and for-profits, kind of LLCs and C Corps. And the reason for that was, in this moment of, really figuring out, how do we make sure that we, all the gains that have happened don't fight back, and that we really kind of have control over some of the levers of power. Elections become a really important part of that strategy, and so that's why 527s can directly intervene in election work, and so that's why we're doing that kind of funding, which we haven't done in the past. So that's the slate, and I want to just give you a couple of, kind of given the focus of transfer finance is more on the for-profit side, a couple of the for-profits that we're investing in and are, looking for folks to invest alongside us. So if I'll just give you two words, and if you're ever interested, please reach out. One is called Vigilant, and what Vigilant does is it allows users to search public data sets in real time. So if you are essentially a campaign and you want to know, like, who's this volunteer, who's coming in and being super helpful, vetting their background, or if you're a media organization and you want to have kind of an update every time a business fires a bunch of people, it's a really powerful tool to do that. They were started actually on the Hillary campaign, and now they're expanded into a number of things. They just got accepted into an accelerator called Menter, and they're raising $500,000. And then Voter Circle is a friend-to-friend outreach platform for campaigns. So really looking at how do we help reduce the cost of running a campaign by having volunteers who are participating in a campaign reach out to their friends in a very easy, streamlined manner. It both increases voter turnout and it increases the odds of a campaign that they'll be able to win. And they're raising $1.5 million. They're in an interesting bucket in that they want to just raise once and bridge to break even, which is kind of an interesting strategy for companies. So that, I think, oh, I guess maybe the last piece, my last slide there, if you want to go to the last one, is kind of the nitty-gritty of how it all works. We have a fairly complex operating model, and so I put together this slide just to make it clear for people. So we're a nonprofit, we are a C3 and a C4, and we're actually fiscally sponsored by the TFINs Foundation. And so we are able to do, kind of conventional charitable C3 work, but also more political work as a C4, and that is where the technical assistance we provide entrepreneurs, a lot of, working with funders, writing white papers, and managing this angel network kind of lives. And then with impact assets, we have this is where our fund lives and is managed by impact assets. And it's a 501c3 fund there, and that is the vehicle we use to make investments and grants. Yeah, that's what I wanted to share. Happy to answer any questions that folks have.
Thank you so much, Julie. There's one direct question while we're still on the slide of your operating model. Again, even though this is not meant to be an investor presentation per se, there was a question on whether New Media Ventures is open to new capital coming into you, and what is the minimum size for that?
Yeah, so we raised 501c3 and 501c4 funds, and we're always open to having more capital flow in. The benefit of having a nonprofit fund is that it's evergreen. You can kind of continuously raise into it. And the minimum into the fund is $25,000, and the minimum to New Media Ventures is, there's no minimum. If folks are interested in moving for-profit capital, basically what we do is we facilitate introductions, and then often we'll be the lead investor. And so we'll work kind of in a, collaborative fashion to have folks move money to the startups. And that is really, the minimum really is dependent on what the startup defines. It's typically $50,000, but it can be much, it's different depending on the startup. And I see I have a question here, which is how long is the process for review for consideration? Is there feedback giving along the way or a decision made? So end to end, the process takes about 3 months for the open call. This last cycle, it took a little bit longer, given we got kind of a way more applications than we were expecting. But we do give feedback once a decision is made. So once we've said, hey, we are not going to fund you, we'll offer feedback to people. And essentially, we'll send them the raw notes from us and from the investment committee, because we find, bluntness is more helpful. And so we'll send folks the anonymized notes and say, hey, this is what folks thought of you. And actually, we've seen a number of times people come in and pitch us again, and they're like, wow, that feedback was super helpful. And, they've integrated the feedback. And a number of times, actually, when people pitch us, 6 months or a year later, they've integrated the feedback, and then we actually fund them then.
Terrific, thank you. Let me see. There is a question, last question for you. Is there a target return or hurdle that you look for on the for-profit investments?
No, so we're really focused on mission. And so, and in particular at the early stage, the hurdle or target return is kind of arbitrary because it's really too early to tell. Like the models just are, everyone has a hockey stick model, and they're not going to hit the hockey stick model, and you're just like, oh, okay, well you have, it's important to think through, but don't want to put too much weight. Looking back, we've been investing via the fund for just a couple of years, so it is too early to tell kind of track record of the fund that we are managing directly. And so that's, but looking back at the angel investments that we have recommended, the return rate there is, it's a positive return rate, somewhere between, 5 and 8%, depending on how you do the math and how much we assume we would have invested at each stage. But, which is fine, definitely not a risk-adjusted return. And so it is really, a good place for people who are thinking about, I really want to be supporting shift in power, and I could either do this by like giving away 501c4 dollars that I will never get back nor get a tax deduction, or I can do it in this complementary. I think people should still do that, but they can also do it in a complementary way where they actually will get the money back to be further kind of reinvested or regranted out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And maybe we can turn it over to Sarah to complement a little bit what Julie was saying and presenting the view from Propel Capital. So thanks, Julie, and thanks to you, Sarah, for joining us.
Great. Thanks. I'm glad to hear Julie's outline again of all the important work they're doing, because it's really, we've been really excited to support it. And I'm excited also just to be part of this conversation. It feels like there are so many disparate things happening that can come together around some of these issues and really have an enormous impact. So I'm glad to be part of the conversation. I think you might need to make me able to, oh, there we go. Okay, great. So I'm going to be much briefer than Julie because she's really the main event, but I'll describe a little bit about who we are and how we came to New Media Ventures, and then welcome any questions along the way. We're a social impact fund. We provide grants and investments. We're also structured as a donor-advised fund housed in impact assets. We actually help bring New Media Ventures to Impact Assets, which is a nonprofit financial services entity. When we established Propel, we looked at creating a private foundation, and we really wanted to keep the structure very lean, and Impact Assets allowed us to do that, and they're also set up to do impact investing. So 100% of our portfolio is invested for impact, and they facilitate an enormous amount of that. Last year, we created an LLC so that we could do some of the fuse impact investments we weren't able to run through Impact Assets because we own too much of the company, and also so we have another tool to fund C4 and 527 organizations to do political organizing. We really look at our capital across the spectrum and work with the organizations that we fund to determine what's the best capital for them. So just briefly, our kind of three main program areas, criminal justice reform. We've done that mostly here in the United States with a particular focus on New York. We were one of the largest supporters of the closed Rikers, the Rikers Commission that called for the closing of Rikers, which is a jail here in New York City, a notorious jail, and three of our grantees really led the effort there. And we also fund, in line with some of the things that Andrea was talking about, we fund leadership training and educational opportunities for people who are currently in prison or formerly incarcerated, because we think the leadership of the movement to address mass incarceration will really come from people who've had lived experience with the system. We also support access to capital, which is around a broader range of entrepreneurs, very much in line with what Andrea was talking about earlier, and people who have lived experience and scalable solutions for key problems in their community. So that ranges from financing for farmer cooperatives around the world, and also underinvested entrepreneurs here in the United States. And then last is progressive organizing, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment, which is what led us to New Media Ventures. And underlying all of it is our approach, which is really thinking we're not the largest investor, so we're constantly looking for ways that we can leverage other investors coming in and provide really flexible capital. We provide multi-year general operating support, really venture-style funding, so that we can allow maximum flexibility for the entrepreneurs, the social entrepreneurs that we're supporting. So this just gives you a snapshot of our portfolio. We're slowly building an endowment. We put in about half. We have about an $8 million budget this year. About half goes to grants and half goes to investments, but again, it's very fluid along the spectrum. Since we were created in 2008, we've deployed about $30 million, and 2/3 of that has happened in the last 18 to 24 months. So we're really scaling up our activities. We have 20 active investments and 30 grants. And as part of what we did in our early years to seed the field of impact investing, we supported a lot of first-time fund managers. And for many of them, they were then able to raise $220 million in their follow-on rounds. And we've helped Impact Assets develop the Impact Assets 50, which talks about the most impact-focused fund managers, and that's part of what we've done to build the field of impact investing. I guess I'd say, just briefly, I wanted to give an example with Root Capital to give you a sense of some of the kind of work that we've done around impact investing. We were their first sub-debt lender. We did a 10-year, $3 million note at 1%, which allowed them to leverage an additional $40 million to lend to small-scale farmers. And that was through an ongoing relationship we'd had with them about what was the financial product that would be most highly leverageable for the populations that they were serving. And that kind of collaborative financial strategizing is what we try to do with the organizations that we're supporting. So just on the progressive organizing side, we created this LLC last fall. We didn't realize how valuable it was going to be from a political funding standpoint, but we, from that, decided to create a $1 million fund to support organizing infrastructure in the United States that would really be ready to translate into voter engagement next year when there are so many critical races and beyond. We're looking at early and growth stage enterprises because we think that's where we can have the most impact, and we think there's a lot of innovation happening at that stage. Not that there aren't amazing organizers and long-term national organizations that have been working in this space, but we think that there's a real opportunity to harness some of the new insurgent efforts since the election and catalyze new funding in that direction. We're really focused on state-based efforts, and we're, again, the way we work with many of our entrepreneurs is giving priority to communities that have not been as well resourced as others. And we think that's really where there's a very exciting opportunity in American politics to shift to a more progressive base. One of the advantages of Propel's small operating staff is that we can make decisions quickly and move quickly. So we're trying to get this money out the door in the next month or so, and we're really hoping that others will do that too. One of the things we found, and Julie could speak to this probably, is that many of the groups, they're just coming together now to develop coalitions, to figure out how they're going to operate on the ground, what are going to be their key states. And so in terms of building electoral power, the sooner this can happen, the sooner they can try out all the creative technology solutions that New Media Ventures is supporting and figure out what really works for their population, the more effective we'll be on the organizing front next year. So just briefly, some of the groups that we're supporting here have to do, some of it is along the same lines as New Media Ventures. We have a couple of efforts to create a new narrative and new messaging, which is Good Pitch Local, which works in swing states with community organizers and filmmakers to craft messages that will generate civic engagement. Indivisible and Sister District are two of the winners of the New Media Ventures, and they're, again, harnessing some of the heightened activity post-election. Just Leadership USA, which is an organization that trains and develops leaders who are formerly incarcerated, in addition to doing advocacy around mass incarceration, and we're helping them add a voter engagement and education effort to their training. And Repairs of the Breach, which is Reverend William Barber in North Carolina, who is helping to create a Moral Mondays movement at state capitals and kind of a new messaging around the Democratic Party. So that's who we are, and how did we come to New Media Ventures? You can see there's a lot of overlap between their areas, their priority areas, and ours. It's been really an exceptional deployment of capital from my perspective. They were the first investment we made. We did it as a grant to their Impact Assets Fund, and it's been, as Julie spoke to, very streamlined, very simple way for us to get money to small organizations that we would never be able to manage that level of due diligence. So, you know, what we see all the time in the investment side of the for-profit side are lots of intermediaries, lots of capital aggregators, and there aren't that many on the not-for-profit side or the hybrid social enterprise side. And so New Media Ventures really feels like it's filling a key gap there. It's both helpful for us as investors and very helpful for the organizations that can then get themselves in front of a whole bunch of investors, as Julie has referred to that. And I already mentioned the due diligence piece. The other piece that's been really helpful for us is just connecting us to like-minded funders and investors. I mean, we're based in New York City. We have connections with others working in this space, but it's just accelerated that. I'm sharing due diligence for some of our Propel Action Fund investees with people in the Soros Foundation or individual progressive-minded investors. And we can just do it very, very quickly and efficiently because we're all part of this New Media Ventures community. And the other thing that's just really impressive to me is how New Media Ventures just jumped on it so quickly during this time. They were just the right organization at the right time, and they were able to turn it around in a speedy way at a time when I think that that's just very critical because there's so much work to be done. The other thing just is the extent to which they're amplifying the work of their organizations. I know that Julie spoke about that, but you know, it's a better bet for me as an investor to invest in some of them because they have this peer cohort, they're getting connected to other investors, they're getting the media platform of New Media Ventures, and that's been enormously helpful. The other point I was thinking of when Julie was speaking is, you know, we don't have tech and media expertise to vet those kinds of projects. I see them all the time, and I really end up declining them because I don't know if somebody's voter registration tool is the most effective one, or if that's going to be successful on a financial or social impact return side. But when New Media Ventures is able to batch them and review them and then also connect them to Facebook or Google or other tech investors, that's a much more efficient deployment of capital. So I think that's, and then one other thing I thought of while Julie was speaking is, you know, we're a small investment team and we don't have the capacity to manage an open call. So it's something that just doesn't sit right with me, is that I end up speaking to people seeking money who have access to me or access to other people in my network, and so to be able to send organizations to New Media Ventures, but also know that they're casting a wider net, and through our support of them, we're casting a wider net is a really helpful piece. So just in terms of what's next for us, how we see this going forward, we're looking, we've already made 2 investments in Sister District and Indivisible, but there are some others in their pipeline that we're using the due diligence from them for and pursuing. So I expect that number will increase. And then, we've worked closely with New Media Ventures on some of these groups providing shared feedback, strategies for other investors they should talk to. Again, it just kind of accelerates the support that we already provide the organizations that we work with. I mentioned already partnering with the other investors, and then the pipeline that we're generating through our own fund of progressive organizations, and hopefully some of them will be in the New Media Ventures, the next round for New Media Ventures. So I think I'll just stop there, and happy to answer any questions about our decision to invest in New Media Ventures or any other things related to the kind of progressive impact investing that you all are focused on.
Splendid. Thank you so much, Sarah. There's one question that I think could go to either of you and fits well with what you just said about sharing the due diligence from Arno Hesse. Says, would New Media Ventures connect with the funding campaigns within the community itself, so where it becomes funding by the community and not just for the relevant community, and whether that would help with the due diligence efforts around it?
Julie, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I might need a clarification. So is the question, how might this connect to funding from communities themselves, beyond just having, us kind of come in from the outside and fund these groups, and that might also help get due diligence information? Is that what you mean? Is that the question?
Yeah, the way that I would look at it is probably along the lines of saying having a combination where you have both almost a crowdfunding element that serves to show the buy-in from the community itself, right? If there is interest in certain things, that serves both as diligence and de-risking. If I remember correctly from Arno's previous work and with Credibles, where you would use almost the data points from the fact that others within the community are interested in investing in something as a way of giving you more information on that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, actually, I have one thing to add, Julie, while you're thinking. I had a conversation with one of the New Media Ventures winners who we haven't funded yet, but we're seriously thinking about. And the social entrepreneur who started that organization is not thinking this way yet, but she's very smart, and I think she will soon. I came away from the conversation the next morning thinking, well, we should give them a grant to support their general operating support, but we should give them a loan too to build their capacity to do. They want to do a membership campaign, and they have a membership model, but they haven't been able to fully scale it up yet. But that we could give them a loan against that and then have them pay us back as they build their membership base. That's not exactly the crowdfunding, but it is, we would need some kind of validation that they have the full support, which we do because of the kind of organization they are. But it would allow us to provide them with the kind of capital that they wouldn't think of asking for. And who knows, we'll see what they say when I propose it to them, but that it could provide them, again, more of this venture startup capital that's flexible, that they can use without having so many strings attached from specific funders with specific metrics and outcomes.
Yeah, definitely. And I would just add to that it is a thing that we look at. So often for advocacy organizations, if they haven't raised money from their membership, it's a big red flag. because that is, if the folks that you're really helping to organize aren't willing to pitch in, then that's, a challenge. And so it is definitely an important data point for us, that, is a community that is being served actually supportive. Sometimes, it's not necessarily just a financial transaction, but it's a lot of just calling the folks who are supposedly being helped or served or organized and make sure that it, that is indeed the nature of the relationship. So a lot of the diligence is into, figuring out what is actually going on.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much. If there is nothing else, or while another last question might come in, I would also encourage folks to look into the work that the Solidago Foundation is doing based out of Northampton, with whom we've been working for a while, in terms of investing and funding at the C3, C4 intersection, and seeing how the potential future revenue of organizations in the space of politics and organizing can be used for current funding streams. So they're doing some very cool, very innovative work in that area.
One other comment I was just going to make is it's been interesting to me talking with some of these organizers who are so excited about the social entrepreneurship space. So to the, the title that you gave this session, Andrea, it's unexpected for some people to think about it that way, because even the example you gave about the supermarket, the idea that somebody would never have thought of themselves as an entrepreneur, but then turn into an entrepreneur to fill a need. One of the New Media Ventures winners who I was speaking with recently was saying all she listens to now are business podcasts, and she never expected. She's a child of immigrants and has been really a grassroots organizer for years, and she's really most excited in what she can learn about scaling from there. And I've been talking, we do some work alongside Reid Hoffman from LinkedIn through one of our investments. He has this new podcast, Masters of Scale, and I keep finding myself referring to it in all the conversations we're having with social entrepreneurs, which feels like it could be such a disconnect, but there are some lessons. Obviously, there's lots of things that are not applicable that point to very large problems in our society, but I think that the entrepreneurial mentality, people have been operating that way out of necessity for a long time, and hopefully if there's now resources to get to them, to help them scale up their ideas, then I think there's just enormous potential there.
One thing what you just said made me think of something, which is I've been thinking a lot about how similar in many ways being a campaigner and an organizer is to being an entrepreneur, where, kind of not taking no for an answer, doing incredible things with no money, persistence, just a lot of those qualities are very similar. And I think part of the reasons many of our investments have been so successful is that they are from people who are organizers that typical VCs would never look at because they're not entrepreneurs. But really, if you think about it, they are entrepreneurs, and they bring kind of an incredible set of skills to bear. So it's interesting that it goes both ways. But there is a lot of similarities in the work.
Lovely. Thank you so much. This was extremely informative for all of us. If you're okay with sharing the slides, Julie and Sarah, a few folks on the line have asked for your to learn about how they can get involved with your work, so I can put in your contact information and pass it along. If anyone who is not a member is interested in learning more about the work of the Investor Network, there's a link here, Kurt, at transformfinance.org, and it will also be in the slide deck for those that requested. We don't otherwise share it. Thank you so much for everybody that participated. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Congratulations for all the spectacular work that you do. Glad to have you here with us.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.